If there's one thing I hate about the modern world, it's the fact that you cannot get anyone to agree on anything. From life-altering concepts down to petty, insignificant nonsense, not only can you not get everyone to agree on a side or what is the best thing to do, but there's often large groups on both sides, even when there really shouldn't be two sides to the argument. I can hardly imagine a group of 10 people coming to a collective agreement that they all, begrudgingly or not, pull through on. And yet, on a rainy Tuesday back in 1955, a whole bustling downtown area and its immediate surroundings were transformed into a ghost town in just over a half an hour. A remarkable event, considering the fact that in order for this to happen, more than 100,000 people had to agree to cooperate with it. And it had a purpose. There was a motivation. This, let's just call it a test, was known as Operation Greenlight. But before we get to this impressive story, there's a lot to go through and understand before we get there. And to get there, you need to understand the notion of civil defense. The concept was really quite simple. While the powers that be in the military would handle most of the dirty work, it was deemed important that even everyday citizens were knowledgeable about what could happen and how to be prepared in the event of an enemy attack. An informed civilian populace only benefited a country, especially in the aftermath of World War II and the dawn of the Cold War. That being said, the notion of a civil defense went back long before World War II, but its deemed significance only grew over time, especially after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, the catalyst pulling America into that Second World War. But after the Allied powers' victory in 1945, the bulk of the American people were only all too happy to revel in their victory and to take full advantage of the prosperity that the country entered after that victory. And with the power of the atom bomb, it was easy for some to assume we had nothing to fear from potential enemies. However, when the Soviet Union successfully detonated an atomic bomb of their own in 1949, everything changed. America's reaction to this was swift. The U.S. Congress passed the Federal Civil Defense Act in 1950, which President Harry Truman then signed off on. This act created a Federal Civil Defense Administration, while at the same time the act put a great deal of the civil defense burden, in particular the educating and preparing of people, on individual states. This led to the creation of such things as the idea of duck and cover. All you had to do was duck under your desk and that pesky radiation would just pass you by. Sure, it was absolute nonsense, but the alternative was something just a bit too horrifying to consider. And then there was Bert the Turtle, the mascot brought on to explain the concept of duck and cover to the children of the world. This was also the age of the fallout shelter, the idea of constructing an underground bunker to hide out in and stay safe from the radiation covering the land above you. When I visited the Wilhelm Mausoleum in southeast Portland a few years back, videoing my experience, one thing that stood out to me along a stairwell within the structure was a sign that had been posted there, noting it was a fallout shelter. A major part of civil defense was teaching the everyday American about these shelters, their obvious benefits, but also what was necessary to survive in one. Somewhere along the line, the alternative to something like a fallout shelter was suggested, that being an evacuation. Despite the Soviet Union having their own bombs now, in the early 1950s, the fastest way to bomb a city in America was to fly bombers there. The hope was then that these bombers could be tracked well in advance, at least a couple hours beforehand, and that a targeted area could be evacuated in that time. When the bombers arrived, thinking they were bombing a major population base, they were really bombing what was almost a ghost town at that point. One of the first cities in the country to dive in and embrace the new culture of civil defense was Portland, Oregon. Before the end of 1950, they had an established civil defense program and a director to lead it. Former state police superintendent Charles Prey would assume this spot, appointed by then Mayor Dorothy McCullough Lee, another strong proponent of having a local civil defense system in place. And come the summer of 1951, Fire Department Captain Jack Lowe would also be brought on by Mayor Lee to help run this organization. And hey, it made sense for not just a place like Portland, but Oregon as a whole, to embrace civil defense against a possible encroaching enemy. During World War II, the state experienced not one, but multiple attacks from the nation of Japan. On June 21, 1942, a Japanese submarine fired on Fort Stevens at the northwest edge of the state, thinking it to be an old run-down fort that they could easily overtake. But in response, those stationed at the fort immediately blacked out any lights and did not return fire to make their exact location difficult to see. Bombers were then sent out to attack the sub, which managed to successfully evade them, but the bombers' presence managed to drive them away. This attempted onslaught only advanced already existing concerns by those living on the West Coast about a possible Japanese invasion. A couple months later, September 9th, a float plane was launched from a submarine with the objective of dropping 2 incendiary bombs in the forest, not far from the coastal town of Brookings. These bombs would then spark forest fires. Fortunately, they were not successful in their objective as they were caught and quickly taken out, but the event represented the first attack on a U.S. state by enemy aircraft. Later, in 1944, Japan began sending out balloons filled with explosives, floating them across the Pacific. Some reached land within the U.S., with the only casualties being a woman and her children in Oregon who stumbled onto one of the downed balloons, unaware of its danger. These people are considered the only combat casualties on U.S. soil during World War II. While these events happened far from Portland, the city was still relatively close to the coast, and the Soviet Union was only a short distance to the northwest across the Pacific. Early on in Portland's efforts, a strong emphasis was put on establishing bomb shelters all over town. The hope over time was that people would establish shelters on their own property, but otherwise, the city sought to establish a $20 million budget in order to construct bomb shelters all over town so that hopefully any citizen would be near one at a given time. A particular focus was to create shelters near the downtown area and any schools around town. Ray Spencer, a former head of a bomb shelter program, projected that without any shelters or methods of protection, if a bomb similar to the one dropped on Nagasaki was dropped on Portland, it would cause about 251,000 deaths and injuries. Jack Lowe deemed this to be an exaggerated number, with his own prediction being closer to around 88,000 people affected by such a bombing. Nagasaki's population was around 195,000 when it was bombed in 1945, resulting in approximately 40,000 deaths from the blast, with thousands then dying later on due to the effects of the bomb. Portland's population was nearly double this, at about 373,000 in the early 1950s, so if simply looking at the numbers, it appears Jack Lowe's prediction was closer to the likely result. However, Lowe would later state in 1954 that if an atom bomb was dropped on Portland, there would probably be around 150,000 deaths just in the downtown area. The feeling at this time was that When the bomb was dropped, practically nobody would be able to escape the downtown area, and downtown would be the most likely target in such an attack. Whatever the predicted numbers were, none of them painted a pretty picture of the City of Roses post-assault. Preparations were swift, with several companies of auxiliary police and bomb reconnaissance units established. More than 50 air raid warning horns were installed around town, and local firefighters were given special training to be prepared for a potential attack. And this was all just by early 1951. It was only the beginning. The following year, voters passed a $600,000 levy with the objective of obtaining equipment and establishing facilities to further help in the city's civil defense efforts. Mayor Lee was directly involved in all of this, but she was also in the midst of an upcoming mayoral election in November 1952, her primary opponent being former city commissioner Fred L. Peterson. These two had been fierce opponents, with Lee ultimately demoting Peterson from his commissioner spot. However, when Peterson emerged victorious in this election, he too was a dedicated supporter of the city's growing civil defense program. After this transition between mayors, the city of Portland also began transitioning in the direction of conducting tests towards a possible evacuation. June 1953 would mark the city's first test using Conelrad, which, established in 1951, was the precursor to the emergency broadcast system, with the focus of using radio stations to transmit important information in the event of a defense emergency. In Portland's case, then, the main focus was just testing such a system to make sure it worked. Once an approaching enemy was detected, all of the available radio stations in town would switch to one of two emergency frequencies wherein information and updates would go out to the public in an effort to keep everyone informed and hopefully quell any panic. A year after the Conelrad test, on June 14, 1954, Portland joined cities all over America in what was called Operation Alert, wherein a theoretical bombing would take place. The main objective here was testing traffic control and to see how quickly people could be, again theoretically, evacuated from a given area. In this practice event, an alert was sent out at 6:55 a.m. reporting 5 enemy bombers approaching the Oregon coast, with Portland being their likely target. The attack took place at 8:25 a.m., with an all-clear given at 10. While the event gave several cities the chance to test aspects of a necessary evacuation, the general consensus reached by the test was that America was a long ways from being properly prepared for a massive attack from overseas. But the test revealed the direction America was going in, and that their best plan during the early 50s was for massive, planned-out evacuations of its cities. And who was prepped to take this challenge on more than anyone else? Portland, Oregon. August 23, 1954, Portland engaged in another test known as Operation Floodout. This test focused on the event of a dam being bombed on the Columbia River, which would likely have caused the worst flood in Portland's history. And beyond that, these floodwaters would have been poisoned with radiation. This was another situation wherein it was projected there would be thousands of deaths at a minimum if such an event happened. But like Operation Alert, the main focus of this test was going through the motions, which was critical, but at the end of the day, an event like this would have required a massive and abrupt evacuation to avoid severe casualties. And come December, another test was done with the focus of being prepared for the relocation of citizens from Portland in the event of an attack. It would ultimately be decided that everyone evacuated from the Portland area would need to be moved at least 20 miles away from town. This graphic shows that there were 3 staging areas established, at least at a time, beyond this 20-mile distance, with one in Forest Grove to the west, Aurora to the south, and Sandy to the east. Perhaps most dystopian about this graphic is its representation of Portland post-attack, wherein we have a mix of utterly wrecked, Dr. Seussian-looking buildings. By this point, the city had firmly dedicated itself to a system of evacuation, a system that would need to be planned to a T, and not only to get as many people out of town as possible, but to have a system in place for everyone afterward. Mayor Peterson called a meeting which included 100 of the city's most influential people, including several prominent businessmen. At this meeting, Jack Lowe laid out the early details of the plan for an actual evacuation, noting it would be an expensive project, but obviously worth it. In the end, the project cost just over $1,800. The plan was organized down to the smallest detail, with multiple civil defense organizations involved and nearly 3 months of preparations. It was projected at least 100,000 locals would be involved in this test, and likely more. A lot of work. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about now. The planned evacuation zone encompassed all of downtown and the area just west of it, going as far as 19th Avenue and covering the mainly commercial area on the east side of the river. The west side was bordered by the Willamette River to the east, Thurman Street to the north, Montgomery Street to the south, and 18th and 19th Avenues to the west, with a brief stretch along 14th Avenue between Mill and Montgomery. On the east side, it was bordered by the river to the west, Hancock Street to the north, Market Street to the south, and 12th Avenue with a hook to 13th to the east. With the most critical aspect of this project being dealing with the traffic moving people out of the evac zone, within this zone several primary exit routes were established. Bridges were obviously critical in this regard, with 5 of them: Broadway, Steele, Burnside, Morrison, and Hawthorne crossing within this zone. And all of these bridges for this test were converted to one-way traffic moving east to hopefully move people out of downtown faster and prevent people on the east side, for whatever reason, from going into downtown. The main routes going east synced with these bridges, including Broadway Street, Oregon Street, Burnside Street, Stark Street, Belmont Street, and Hawthorne Boulevard. These routes would lead most to the east edge of the zone, or 12th Avenue, or take them beyond that and out of the zone. Grand and Union Avenues were also used to move traffic north and south on the east side, running parallel to 12th. This would also include Williams Avenue to the north end of the zone, its main purpose being to funnel traffic north from those crossing the Broadway Bridge. The main downtown area was to be the most confusing, especially with its one-way system. With Montgomery being the southern end of the zone, any southbound streets south of Burnside could be used to exit that way. The main routes going west to evacuate from downtown were Montgomery Street, Market Street, Jefferson Street, Burnside Street, Gleason Street, and then Marshall and Lovejoy Streets, which would both direct traffic towards Cornell Road, leading them into the hills. And finally, going northbound on the west side, the primary routes included 9th Avenue, 14th Avenue, and 18th Avenue, all leading traffic to Front Avenue and Highway 30 to the north. There was a lot going on here, but as long as people knew individually where they were going and the most sufficient way to get there, the hope was it would not be too difficult for people to understand. To assist in all of this, the traffic signals in town were wired up so that with the flip of a switch, the signals would begin following a particular pattern that gave all green lights when possible for these streets most critical in getting traffic out of the evac zone. This aspect of the plan is actually what gave the test its name, Operation Greenlight. Crossing traffic would be stuck on red and be forced to turn with traffic whenever an opening for them presented itself. People were also encouraged to carpool on this day, which would allow for fewer cars within the zone. Also, for those who normally took public transportation, there was no guarantee that the buses would stay generally on their routes or be on time. Obviously, a project of this size, involving so many people and covering so much space, law enforcement involvement was a key aspect to this project. And the local police put everything they had into this test, securing upwards of 1,000 men to be on duty for it. Making sure everyone complied was the top priority, as the city's police chief and one of the great scumbags of mid-20th century Portland, Jim Purcell, made it known that the force would go hard on those who were non-compliant with this plan. The police would, thus, be key in monitoring traffic and making sure it flowed smoothly, while also being stationed along the borders of the evac zone to make sure vehicles were not trying to enter the zone while the test was in effect. A temporary ordinance was also passed for this test, making it unlawful for anyone to disobey any orders from not only police officers but also any civil defense officers in the area. Despite all of this, no arrests would be made during the conducting of this test. But beyond making sure everyone was compliant, which ultimately wouldn't be all that much of an issue, police also needed to be stationed close by to monitor a large area that was about to become a criminal's paradise. No people, no witnesses, blocks and blocks of commerce with who knew what kind of treasures to be snatched. But because the police couldn't be everywhere at once, they encouraged all business owners in the zone to keep their money and valuables in a safe space and to make sure all their doors were locked upon departure. In this vein, a small concession was allowed by the city, who was telling everyone they needed to comply. This being, if a business could not guarantee the safety of their belongings or the security of their building, any custodial staff they had on hand could stay behind in the building during the test. Fortunately, looting and robbing would also end up not being a problem during this test. And while they would, in the case of a real-world evacuation, for this test, local firefighters were not evacuated with everyone else. Rather, they worked within the area with a focus not too different from the police monitoring crime, in that they were on the lookout for any possible fires, be they accidental or incendiary in nature. The last thing the city needed was for everyone to leave and have a random fire start in the middle of its primary commercial district, and possibly go unmonitored for a minimum of several minutes. Business owners in the area were also asked to check and double-check any possible fire hazards within their establishments before the evacuation took place. With most locals in support of the city's civil defense program, they were quick to throw their support behind this evacuation plan. That was just one element that made preparations easier. Businessmen in the downtown area started making preparations right away. Hotel proprietors would give out instructional sheets to guests. Local medical personnel agreed to not make any appointments on the day of the evacuation. While not practical in a real-world situation, for the sake of the test, vehicles would only be allowed to park in garages in the downtown area. None were allowed to be parked along the streets. Taxi drivers wouldn't charge a fare if they had a customer when the evacuation started, which would force them to take said customer to an area outside the evacuation zone. With the test probably happening in the morning or early afternoon on a weekday, schools within the evacuation zone also had to be considered. The plan was set for all kids in the 4th grade or lower to be released from school ahead of time, and any kids of a higher grade would simply be released once the sirens went off and taken by their buses out of the evac zone. Ultimately, when the sirens would sound and this test began, it was after most schools would have already been dismissed. The one school within this zone, still in operation when the sirens sounded, was Portland State University on the southern edge of downtown. All of its students, obviously, would be evacuated with everyone else, and once the test was done, they could come back and resume their studies. A written work by engineer Willard Bascom dove directly into the questions the city hoped to answer through conducting this evacuation. Within it, director Jack Lowe was quoted to say, "The test has to put some load on the plan and force it to break down at its weakest point. It has to be big enough to be significant." Hence the large amount of space that was set to be evacuated. And while a successful test was hoped for, it was critical to recognize what was unsuccessful about it and needed adjustment. Lives were hanging in the balance after all. Other lingering questions included, would the public participate? Not a light question. It wasn't just about what percentage of people would participate, but also addressing the possibility that some folks might be resistant to this evacuation for whatever reasons. How would municipal services be maintained during such a test? How would you persuade all the businessmen in town to close up shop early and send employees home? Another key element of the test, to try and keep it as authentic as possible, was to have some element of surprise to address the further question of how people would react in an evacuation situation with as little prep time as possible, as would be the case in a real-world evacuation. Initially, they only told the public that the test would take place after 2 p.m. on either Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, the week of September 26, 1955. This was all anyone knew prior to the sirens going off announcing that the test had officially begun. A further complication with the planned time for the test was the weather, which would be rainy all week, a rarity for late September in Portland. These rainy conditions led the city to ponder delaying the test, but ultimately they decided to stick with the plan of having it that week. Only then would these questions be answered. Title. In those days leading up to the test, something that was imperative in terms of making the project a success was the local media, which went to great lengths to keep locals in the know about what was happening. Reports over the radio were frequent, and local papers posted about the project on the daily. Local civil defense personnel made frequent appearances on television to keep the people informed. In particular, the Oregonian ran almost daily articles that consisted of questions with answers, and on a given day, those questions focused on a particular aspect of the planned evacuation. This answered questions before they even had to be asked, with the added objective of keeping people from making bad decisions when those sirens went off. For instance, one question asked about a bunch of people just using public transportation. Along with the fact that there wouldn't be enough running buses to evacuate most people that way, a major focus of the project was getting every car out of the evacuation zone, which would have been adversely affected if people were just taking the bus and leaving their cars in town. And when another question asked, well, if no other cities were doing this, then why was Portland? The simple response was that each city in America was responsible for their own civil defense planning. And that was it. There were other motives, but the city of Portland wanted to serve as a guiding light for the rest of the country that a planned evacuation was a viable idea to evade approaching bombers likely looking to attack a major city. The Oregonian posted these pieces up until the very end. They'd done just about everything they could, and now everyone, including personnel from several states across the country, had to wait and see what happened. the sounds of sirens erupted, indicating that Operation Greenlight was underway. Despite maintaining an element of surprise in that up to this moment the exact day and time were unknown, it seems this information had leaked to a degree to the public. It was noticed that in the hour leading up to the test beginning, thousands of people were seen to leave the area, almost like they knew what was coming. But still, once the test began, there were approximately 101,000 people within the zone that needed to be evacuated, and a time of about an hour was set as a goal for the zone to be emptied. There were still lingering concerns about the inclement weather and how the wet streets would affect traffic and how the pouring rain would affect pedestrians leaving on foot. But when all was said and done, come 3:44 p.m., it was determined downtown alone had been successfully emptied of people and their vehicles. This, the most difficult evacuation area, was cleared out in only 34 minutes. And only 15 minutes later, it was determined the whole zone was cleared out, and at 3:59 p.m., Mayor Peterson called Civil Defense Headquarters, telling them to terminate the test. The whole thing had been a remarkable success. A whole downtown section turned into a ghost town in less than an hour. It was a major relief for the mayor, who staked a lot of his reputation on this project working out, and a lot of the public could have just refused to cooperate. The test had proved that the evacuation of a major city was both a possible and viable option while facing evil. At this time, approaching bombers could often again be detected a few hours ahead of time, making an hour or so evacuation effective. Simply put, the reason the operation was so successful came down to the fact that practically everyone cooperated. The police made no arrests, there were no reports of unruly citizens, no crimes were committed, and the people, despite the miserable weather, played ball. Many of these people were pedestrians forced to walk the streets. While single-story buildings, hotels, and small businesses would understandably be able to evacuate rather quickly, the test also showed that larger buildings with larger numbers of people could also be evacuated, and quickly. For reference, more than 400 employees were evacuated from the Oregonian building in 5 minutes. The state office building evacuated around 1,000 people in 5 minutes as well. The county courthouse evacuated about 600 people in 5 to 7. The federal courthouse evacuated about 550 people in 7 minutes. And the Department of Interior building cleared 1,250 people in 9 minutes. The federal courthouse was particularly impressive as the elevators in the building were out, forcing everyone to use the stairs to leave. And in the case of the county courthouse, prisoners being kept there were not evacuated, and just enough personnel was kept behind there to monitor them. There were some minor traffic issues early on, as one might expect, primarily a few vehicles dismissing the red lights that were there to force them to turn with the rest of traffic, creating obstructions on the main evacuation routes. Pedestrians forcing their way across these main routes to get to their vehicles also created brief issues. Short-term congestion was also created early on when vehicles stopped to try and pick up other pedestrians. But while this was an issue early on, it was a pertinent one, as in a real-world evacuation, it was pushed by the city that any cars leaving town be filled to capacity, picking up as many pedestrians on the street as possible. After a couple of minutes, these problems passed, and traffic began to flow more smoothly. While the Broadway and Hawthorne bridges saw a great deal of traffic, the other bridges had a relatively easy flow. This included the Burnside Bridge, whose traffic, according to Oregonian reporter George Spania, had dwindled to a trickle by 3:30. This was made more impressive by the fact that a car accident had happened by the east side approach to the Burnside Bridge only minutes before the siren went off, but it was cleared out of the way just in time. The only other accidents that occurred were two simple fender benders that happened on the Broadway Bridge and didn't stall traffic. Tragically, there would be one death that occurred during this test. Alden E. Erickson, a 50-year-old civil defense worker who was stationed at Northwest 18th and Gleason, collapsed due to a heart attack and was deceased upon his arrival at the hospital. On a side note, another man had passed away only days before the test, with his funeral scheduled at a time wherein the test may have taken place at a location within the evacuation zone. Reportedly, people at the Civil Defense Headquarters bore some resentment over this, to which I say, literally screw you. It was just a test and these people were grieving the death of someone who had just died. Anyway, despite the success of this test and the nationwide applause for it, I mean, it was no doubt a remarkable success, especially considering the simple fact that nowadays there's no way such a test would be successful. There are imperfections that need to be discussed. Not discussed in an overly critical sense, but simply to acknowledge certain things that did take a little shine away from how things had gone. First off, there simply weren't anywhere near the same number of people in downtown as there would be on a usual day. People knew the test would happen sometime that week, keeping many out of the evacuation zone on those days altogether when they would otherwise be there. The rainy weather also kept people from going into town. Several businesses just stayed closed rather than needing to face abrupt closure once the sirens went off. These are businesses that would have been open on any normal day. And again, many people were seen to leave the downtown area in the hour before the test began. On a normal day, there would have been, at the very least, thousands more people within this zone, guaranteeing a longer evacuation. Granted, it likely wouldn't have extended the process too much longer, and for the time, people could have still easily evacuated ahead of the arrival of any enemy bombers. We also have to acknowledge that this area that was cleared out in just under 50 minutes is, while the most congested part of town, a small portion of the overall Portland metropolitan area. A full evacuation of that area would encounter far more traffic and considerably more panic, especially if a real event was taking place. Again, this is not to minimize the success of Operation Greenlight. For all its success, nobody was calling it a cure-all. It was just the best option for a major American city at that time. And while I've mentioned some of those that were allowed to stay in the evacuation zone during the test, there were more, namely those with health issues. Those specifically living in what were called transient hotels were allowed to stay, as many of these individuals were older men, often suffering from alcoholism. Also, those that were hospitalized were not forced to evacuate, as only makes sense. A Dr. Harold M. Erickson would write a piece in 1956 that specifically focused on his concerns about hospitalization when something like Operation Greenlight takes place, only no longer as a test. While calling the operation impressive, he noted how, with those hospitalized not being evacuated, the city wouldn't really know exactly what complications could arise during a real event. Erickson noted hospitals would take much longer to evacuate, and if an attack were to happen during, say, the middle of the night, it would happen at a time when many hospital administrators would be at home. And if they couldn't be on scene right away, who would take control? What would the evacuation plan be? Erickson had also been involved in the evacuation of the hospital in Vanport, the town north of Portland that was destroyed in minutes by a flood in May 1948. He noted that while engaging in a hospital evacuation during a disastrous event, there was complete pandemonium in his office when Vanport flooded. He was quoted to say, "In brief, during the first few hours, communications and transportation broke down, and the residents of the area were entirely dependent on their own resources." He was calling out the simple, unavoidable fact that during a real situation, people would not act the same as they did during this test. He noted further problems such as the number of people that could be hospitalized in a large city at any given time and the drama of moving them. And in that time, right after a tragic event, those hospital patients, along with anyone hurt in that event, would have to rely on local resources until they could get federal support. And this was another critical aspect of the evacuation. While the main focus was to see how quickly everyone could leave a given area, the test also sought to see how relocating everyone to points outside the Portland area would go. This was critical as there would likely be many injured people in need of immediate treatment. Many would be displaced, perhaps permanently, and locations would need to be established ahead of time so as to provide short-term housing, food, medication, and so on. During Operation Greenlight, 50 individuals living at the Ione Plaza apartments, located along the park blocks in downtown, were evacuated and taken to the town of Newburgh, to Portland's southwest. These people would then simulate refugees having been relocated from the city. By no means a perfect system, but still, damn, was it impressive. It was an instance where a huge portion of a city acknowledged a very real danger and, for the most part, worked together to make a massive operation happen. After this success, several other American cities conducted their own tests, although never to the same depth that Portland did on that February afternoon. One of the largest other tests done was conducted in Charlotte, North Carolina, but even then, only 20,000 people were involved. Internationally, only 2 days after Portland's test, a similar test called Operation Lifesaver was conducted in Calgary, Alberta. Their test would prove unsuccessful as, of an expected 25,000 individuals involved, only about 5,000 took part. This was mostly blamed on the cold, snowy weather at the time, as well as dwindling enthusiasm among locals. Ultimately, nothing came close to matching the magic that happened in Portland. Then, August 21st, 1957, the Soviet Union successfully tested their first long-range ballistic missile, showing it was only a matter of time before America's Cold War enemy would also be able to launch catastrophic weapons a long distance in a short period of time. This would not invalidate the success of Operation Greenlight, but it officially invalidated its effectiveness. No longer could a massive American city be guaranteed a successful mass evacuation before an enemy's weapon reached its target. Certainly, if an incoming weapon was detected, people would be alerted to leave, but the casualties would have been unfathomable. While the attention to detail and intensity by those involved clearly indicated a motive of a city wanting to save its citizens, there were other considerations. As far back as 1952, the city had high hopes for establishing a large underground site that could serve as a city hall in the case of a nuclear attack. And the city was right behind them, passing a vote to establish such a site. At the time, the city council believed such a site would cost over $600,000. Shortly after the success of Operation Greenlight, construction would begin on such a site at the top of a butte on the east end of town. And y'all know what that means. We're going back to Kelly Butte. Longtime viewers will know this is a place I've been to and referenced in videos numerous times. My most viewed video is a 2018 piece about the Butte's history, wherein I briefly referenced the success of Operation Greenlight. Completed in 1956, This is where Portland's underground facility was located, or the Doomsday bunker as some call it. Vacant since the 1990s and becoming a haven for transients, the old bunker was buried in the mid-2000s.
Daunting. Walking into the great unknown, but this is at least the remains of a trail. Okay, now you're speaking my language. Wow, this is interesting. This looks like pretty old concrete. And there's something here. I don't know what this is. Looks like a futuristic building. Some whatnot. Yeah, this like a pipe. Yeah, I'm really not sure. But I think we're on the right path. Thank you, cup holder. There's this tiny little baby trail here. And that is how you get to the staircase. So yeah, it looks like people just walk down these stairs. God, I'm just thinking about who went down these, armed forces people, people, used to work for the police departments. And, the staircase kind of just becomes buried under these, shrubs and whatnot. And then you look dead ahead and there's the bunker. It's just all right here. And there's chunks of just stuff. Another chunk of concrete, little metal. It's like the outline of like a... So the entryway is buried deep in there somewhere. Yeah, see there's... Wow! Shit! There's another big chunk of concrete right over here, kind of around the wall. But wait, we're not done. There's more! And as we walk towards where roughly the back end of this really large structure would have been, I missed this on my first visit. I noticed this. It's like, oh, we got some curbs, kind of here with all the whatnot. And then I turned and I saw this. And at first, I thought this might have been where the antenna was, but it was too far away. This right here is a backside, sealed off exit, almost an escape hatch, if you will, from the bunker that would have gone back here, and this would have came out the backside. So, this here is just a big chunk of concrete that they put over it to block the entryway. Because if this was left open, even if there was a door there, people would have been beating and breaking at this to get down in there to see what's still there.
In recent years, after someone managed to dig down and actually access the bunker, it was buried again. It was massive, made to hold backups of city documents and also house up to 250 people in the event of an atomic attack. So, I guess at least Portland's most important people would have had a place to hide. But almost as quickly as this facility was erected, the support for civil defense in the city began to dwindle, especially with the Soviet Union's weapon capabilities continuing to increase. When the destructive Columbus Day storm struck the city in 1962, with then Mayor Terry Shrunk out of town, a strong opportunity was provided for Portland to test out the purposes of its underground bunker. But that never happened. Finally, the following year, voters voted down a measure to continue funding the city's civil defense program, thus ending Portland's association with this manner of defense. But prior to this, the Kelly Butte Bunker would serve as a backdrop for a film shot in September 1957 titled The Day Called X. In this CBS program, hosted by actor Glenn Ford, it presented a general recreation of the events that occurred during Operation Greenlight, except under a presumed actual attack. You can see on film the streets of downtown Portland cleared out. This film was actually shot on September 27, 1957, 2 years to the day after the actual operation took place. With the passage of time, in this instance, the Civil Defense Center was heavily involved in this film, showing off the state-of-the-art setup that this city had, probably trying to entice other cities around the country to produce something similar. This film is perhaps the strongest reminder out there to many that this event ever took place, seeing as the film is easily accessible just about anywhere and serves as a gripping and eye-opening representation of how people were feeling and what the documentary style was at that time. One may watch it and think the whole thing outlandish, only to find much of what is covered actually happened. Without any danger, of course. The 1950s would prove to be only the beginning of the Cold War tensions in the world, with things peaking in the 1960s with events such as the Bay of Pigs invasion and the paramount event of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it wouldn't be until the end of 1991 that this war would finally officially end. It impaled such a hatred of communism into Americans that even today you'll see people out there calling something communist just because they don't like it. Alas, America today has a lot of people like that, loving or hating things they often don't even understand. And that's not a promotion of communism. But the truth is, divisions abound, some necessary, many not. We find ourselves today in a most divisive time, where you often can't get 10 people in the same room to agree on one thing. While back in 1955, more than 100,000 people were able to reach an agreement, no matter their personal background, beliefs, or associations. And believe me, I'm all about disassociating from hateful, toxic people in your life. But even then, there are some instances where you at least wish everyone could come together, such as in their very fight for survival, which many people thought we'd face at some time or another during the Cold War. An event such as that of Operation Greenlight is not something we will ever see again.